availability, infinite scalability, pay what you use. Wow, that's a lot of cool things. We all like to not have downtime and reduce costs, and I'm sure you've heard at least one of those things already today, but what are we actually getting ourselves into? If I ultimately want to do a thing, I need a place to do that thing. Traditionally, that's a server, where through some posted forms or on page render, I might do some processing or work based off of user input or interaction. But you already know where this is headed. We're trying to avoid our servers. We want serverless. So how does this work? We're going to talk about how we can manage our media, and particularly how we can do that without a server. So who am I? I'm Colby Fayock. I'm the one hugging BB-8 and Kylo Ren over there. I work with the dev community as a developer experience engineer at Cloudinary. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the web by just Googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. Now, as you might imagine given this talk, in my world, the thing I usually want to do revolves around media. And when I say media, I mean images and videos, and let's not forget our audio friend that often gets let out. Now, if the thing I want to do is manage my media, I also want to figure out a place to do that thing. And if that's not a server, where actually is it? That's where serverless comes in. My goal of this talk isn't to teach you about serverless itself. Hopefully you learned a bit about that from some of the awesome talks today. But my goal is to teach you about how we can solve problems in a serverless world. To do that, we're going to use serverless functions, which is going to be the place where we do our media management work. It's likely the most popular type of serverless capability, but let's briefly recap what are serverless functions. Well, you can think of it like any function you would write in your code. You have your optional input and output. You can also perform any kind of side effects you want as long as it fits within the environment and the time limit. Ultimately, you just need to perform some kind of response by firing a callback and basically declaring whether it was successful or not. We have a lot of options for how we can deploy this function. Using typical cloud services like AWS, GCP, or Azure, we can deploy functions and set up services to invoke those functions. But usually this is set up to work alongside an endpoint, where that endpoint would actually hit that function. And usually you need to set that kind of thing up manually when directly using services like AWS. But what I find more interesting, or at least an easier route, are services like Netlify and Vercel that abstract away the need to manage all those pieces. All you need to do is set up your function code in a file and they deploy the rest. We can very easily scaffold new functions by simply creating a file in our project in the right directory. By default, you can add your files to an API folder. The default folder does vary by platform, but then we use file-based routing, which then makes the function available at /API, then your file name. So in this example we have here on the screen, if I have myfunction.js inside of my API folder, this is going to be available at mydomain.com/yourprovider's-API route/myfunction. At this point, I can really do whatever I want in this function within the scope of the resources available. So here, I'm just simply passing back a message that says hello world. Now, I'm a big fan of Next.js, which provides serverless APIs as part of its toolset. If you're deploying to places like Vercel and Netlify, you're really doing the same thing. The biggest difference is where the files are located, where inside of the Next.js project, it will be available in pages/API. Now, if you prefer, you could just as easily move that to the folder configured for your favorite platform, like that API folder we were talking about. You would then just need to likely use the platform CLI for local development instead of the Next.js development flow. And how you reference that API might change a little bit given it's not as fully integrated into the framework stack, but ultimately, either way, you're deploying a serverless function as an API to that platform. So back to our super complex diagram, we've already defined what we wanted to do. And now we define where we want to do it. So now let's talk about managing our media inside of serverless functions. Most serverless providers support a few different runtimes, including Node.js, Go, Python, and Ruby. But given we're in the Next.js world here, and generally I'm a JavaScript guy, we can stick with Node.js, where then we can start using the Cloudinary Node SDK to perform custom actions. And just to quickly note, if you do prefer other runtimes, Cloudinary has SDKs for each of those languages. So just so you don't feel left out, we do have Ruby, Python, and Go. But in Node, we can start to import our Cloudinary module, configure our account by specifying our cloud name, where then we have full access to do whatever we want. Here, we're simply generating a URL by passing in a public ID. But this can start to be handy where we're doing this programmatically, or more so when we need to make secure requests that require sensitive information that we don't want inside of the client. That's where using serverless functions really shine inside of this stack, where we can configure our API keys and secrets for our Cloudinary account, allowing us to make signed uploads or perform any kind of action that requires authentication. Like here, I'm taking image data that was posted to this endpoint and passing it right inside of the Cloudinary uploader, returning the results of that upload, and essentially creating a secure proxy that I can now use within my application. Now, as another quick aside, if you're wondering about security around that, by default, the functions do not add CORS headers, meaning you can't make cross-origin requests. That said, you want to make sure that your requests are only made from an app level if they have the ability to do so, such as having some kind of authentication layer that checks if it is an authenticated session making that request. Now, just to visualize this a bit before we move on, we're starting off inside of our Next.js application, where for all intents and purposes, we have a React app once it hits the client. Inside this app, we can make client-side requests to our endpoint, which is where our serverless function comes in, where it will execute that serverless function we built, running anything we include inside, like running our Cloudinary SDK, where we can upload and manage resources or do whatever we want. Once our tasks are complete, our endpoint returns a response, including an HTTP code describing whether or not it was successful, which lets our Next.js application handle that response client-side, continuing on with whatever action our visitor was performing inside of the app. But now we can take that to another level. When utilizing Cloudinary, we get a lot more features available to us on top of that simple upload. For instance, maybe we want to customize our upload parameters, such as self-generating a public ID if I'm using my own convention, and providing tags so I have a sane way of finding my images out of potentially thousands. You can even set custom access controls requiring usage of images to provide an authenticated token, along with a variety of analysis options to take a deeper look at your media. But we're going to look at an example of how we can utilize add-ons that extend the capabilities of Cloudinary. Here in the snippet, we're using two different examples of add-ons that we can use: removing the background of images with Cloudinary AI and auto-tagging with Google. First, using AI background removal, when uploading an image to Cloudinary with background removal enabled, Cloudinary will kick off a process that uses AI to intelligently remove that background. Once complete, you can set up a notification endpoint to trigger next steps, or you could pull the resource until you see a completed status inside of the response. And while Keanu works really well as a model, this becomes more interesting in other use cases like e-commerce, where we can take a single well-photographed product and we can change the backdrop in which it's presented, whether that's a simple background color to match the UI, or if we wanted to put it in an environment that's out of this world. We can also use Google's auto-tagging add-on, which has a version available for both images and videos, might I add, that lets us process our images using Google's Vision AI to automatically add tags to all of our media. This quickly becomes critical when managing huge libraries of images, where it can be very difficult to find a specific image if you have absolutely nothing to search on rather than just a randomly generated ID. Or applying this to applications, maybe you want to give your visitors a way to search for their own media or show related media based off of what they're currently looking at. Tagging can eat up a ton of resources if you're trying to do this manually with your team, where you can get a pretty quick win with this add-on. But pulling this all together, we can provide a wide variety of capabilities and controls to customize our uploads to work exactly how we want them. So what does this look like in a real-world application? So if you've been to some of the dev conferences within the past couple years, such as this one, there's a chance that you saw Cloudinary that was sponsoring. If the event was in person, we typically have a booth, but we wanted to do something a little bit more interesting than just us sitting behind a table. So we built CloudyCam. While there's a million different applications we could talk through, I built this as a way to try to recreate filter-oriented apps like Instagram and Snapchat. The idea being you take a picture of yourself with your own device webcam and immediately get access to a wide variety of Cloudinary tech to customize your photos, whether you want to deal with it or pretend that you're Darth Vader on what actually appears to be a moon. While the application might seem like it involves a lot of complicated features to make it work, really the most complicated part in this is the local state management. Next.js as the portal into the React application makes this pretty easy for dealing with the front end, and using serverless functions for proxying media requests, we can let Cloudinary handle a lot of the heavy lifting with its wide feature set. To get started, we want to be able to snag a picture using somebody's device. We can use React Webcam, which allows us to use the native device's browser APIs inside of React. Once we snag that picture, we can set it into state and show the still instead of the live feed. At this point, we have raw image data inside of the browser. Cloudinary likes raw image data, so we can forward that data right along to our endpoint. In this example, anytime the image variable changes, which is what's storing that data, our useEffect hook fires off in an asynchronous function. Here we're using a self-invoking async function, which then allows us to use the async await syntax, which it's just a bit of a personal preference because you can absolutely chain on a then at the end of that. But inside we have the fetch API that we post to our endpoint, again passing that raw image data that's stored in state. We'll get to the endpoint in a second here, but then we can grab that JSON response. We can then take those results and use React State to store that data, which here's a quick look at the results that we get from a Cloudinary upload. Primarily in our use case, we're interested in the public ID and the Cloudinary secure URL. This gives us our ability to reference our new image. But if you notice, we're setting those results as the main property. This is allow us to get both the full image source as well as having another image with the background removed. So having those multiple options and pulling on that thread, we're going to do a very similar thing here now, where this time we're waiting for our state data to update. Specifically, we're waiting for our main image data to be available, and once it is available, we're going to fire a similar post to our upload endpoint, only this time, we're additionally passing some options that we want to remove the background using Cloudinary AI, along with our original Cloudinary upload as the new source. We can simply pass the URL this time into the Cloudinary uploader because it also takes in remote sources, making us having to reduce that additional upload. Now the tricky thing is our response object this time will give us a new image, but our background removal status will only be pending. So we have two options here, which we kind of alluded to before. We can either set up a notification URL by creating a new serverless function, which Cloudinary will hit once it's ready, or we can pull the resource. Now, in my case, I used the polling technique from the client. This code would follow immediately after the upload we saw on the previous slide, where we take the resulting image and start to check its status by requesting the resource's details. This happens in a new serverless function API that I created that specifically returns the resource's details. With this recursive function, we keep checking if it's still pending, but each time we're getting a response that looks similar to our upload response. But this time, we're waiting until we see a status to complete, and once it is complete, we resolve that status check and continuing on updating our local state. Now, at this point, we have two images uploaded. Our primary image, which is an upload from our webcam, and we have a transparent version, but now we're interested in adding some effects. Where at this point, we can be really as creative as we want. We have both the full library of default transformations that Cloudinary provides, as well as really being able to make up some fun ones of our own, like adding some deal with it glasses using Cloudinary's face detection. Well, here I'm just using the simple gravity or the focal point that we can then add the glasses on top of, but you can also take this another step using the advanced facial attributes add-on. But then we can add a background from the office, or scratch that. How about the this is fine meme, where since we have the transparent image, I can add this as an underlay underneath the image. So we're adding it as a background right below it. Followed by adding myself in a frame that was on the door of friends. This one was actually tricky because not only did I need to use face detection for the glasses, I needed to detect the face of the person, then set up a crop that would center my face within that frame. But once we have our finished piece of art, we want our visitors to share their creations. The cool thing in Next.js is this makes it really simple, where we could probably use something like SSR or server-side rendering, but we want to do this statically and use on-demand generation. So we can make a real-time request to anything that's available in our Cloudinary cloud and build it with a page. So technically, we could probably send them our existing public ID, maybe include the transformations as URL parameters, but that turns into one big nasty URL. Given what we just went through, we can just as easily upload our image again and then pass that public ID to the URL, making that shared URL much simpler and less prone to break when getting shared. So back into our code, we're using getStaticProps to statically compile our page. This allows us to grab our parameter and use the Cloudinary SDK to pass back our resource right away. Now, the tricky thing here is when you use getStaticProps, you're typically mapping out all of your paths inside of getStaticPaths. So Next.js knows that the path actually exists, but we just created that public ID, so we don't know that it exists yet. And we really don't want to run a whole new build just to build that one new page. So instead, we're simply going to say that we don't want to pre-render any of the paths, and we want to make sure our fallback is blocking, meaning that we're going to fulfill that request after the new page is generated. This will save us some time on build, but it'll also give us the ability to build out that new share page on the fly with our new public ID. And fun fact, if you're actually doing this on Netlify, this happens via an on-demand builder that is a serverless function. Now back to get static props. This works by using file-based routing, where our file route is a dynamic route. We're saying here that in our brackets in a name that the public ID is going to be our parameter. When Next.js sees that in the URL, it uses it to build the page by passing it to our data fetching functions, where we can then load up that data. But with that, we have our image, and we can create an experience that makes it a lot of fun for people to actually share their results. So now it's time for a demo, where we're going to see how easy it is to spin up Cloudinary inside of a serverless function. So we're going to bootstrap a new Next.js project, we're going to create a new API, and we're going to see how we can work with our media using the Cloudinary Node SDK. So let's go. All right, so we're going to start off here inside of my Cloudinary account, where I'm going to head over to my media library, and we can see that I uploaded some images to start. And really, this is just going to give us a starting point so we can see how we can work with these images, pull them into our application. And we're going to do that with serverless functions, where particularly I'm going to use Next.js to see how this works, where you don't necessarily have to use Next.js. It's just an easy way for me to get up and running with an application and a serverless API. And to do that, I'm going to run yarn create next app. And I'm going to say more serverless as my project name. But what's going to happen now inside of the background is it's going to pretty much pull down the default Next.js starter from GitHub or wherever it's stored, and it's going to install all the dependencies as well as reset Git history and basically just give me a starting point. So I'm going to cd into that new directory. I'm going to run yarn dev just so that we can see what we're starting with. We can see that in the background, it's going to start to build this page, and we have our new Next.js application. Now, the starting point, we want to look inside of the code. So we can see here that under pages/API, what we're interested in is not Copilot, but we're interested in this hello endpoint here, where by default, Next.js gives us a serverless function that we can start to work with. Now, if I run yarn dev again, and I actually try to go to API/hello inside of my browser, because we use the file-based routing, we can see that we get our name of John Doe, just like the response inside of this function. Now we want to create a new endpoint. I'm going to call it resources because ultimately we're going to return resources. I'm going to make this an async function because I want to be able to use the async await syntax in there. But just to make sure that our new endpoint is working, I can hit /resources, and we see that that is indeed working. So now that we have our new serverless API endpoint, and literally all we did was create a new file with that simple handler code inside, what I want to do is start to use Cloudinary inside of this serverless function so we can see how we can grab our media. So to start, I'm going to head to my terminal, and I'm going to run yarn add Cloudinary, which is going to install the Node SDK. And we can see all the documentation for the Node SDK right inside of the Cloudinary docs, where we can see exactly how we want to install it and set it up. And we're going to use particularly v2 of this library. So if I head back to my code, we can see that it's already installed. I'm going to run yarn dev again, so we can not have to worry about that later. I'm going to say I want to import constant Cloudinary. We're going to set that equal to require Cloudinary. We're going to use .v2, which is going to give us v2 of the Cloudinary library. Now, the only other thing we need to do in order to configure Cloudinary is also specify our configuration. So I'm going to say cloudinary.config, where we're going to pass in an object. And to start, all we need to do is pass in our cloud name. And I'm going to add my cloud name of more serverless, where you can also get that by going inside of your dashboard inside of your account. And you see the cloud name right at the top there. So you can just copy that, pasted it into the cloud name value, and now we have access to start using the SDK. So to start, let's try to actually just grab a URL of an image and pass it back inside the API. So I'm going to use constant URL is equal to cloudinary.url. And here, what we want to do is pass in the public ID of the image or the resource that we want to grab. So I'm going to head in, go to my media library, and let's choose this mountain with the sky because I think this is pretty cool looking. I'm going to grab that public ID at the top here. I'm going to add it right inside of that URL right there. And I'm going to pass back the URL this time instead of John Doe. So if I head back to my browser at resources and I refresh, we can see that we're now generating that URL by that public ID. We can see there's not currently any parameters, but we can see that it is giving us the exact URL structure that we need just by passing in that public ID as well as our configured cloud name. So if I open that up in a new browser, we can see exactly what we'd expect. We do have our new image that we just pulled from the account. Now let's take that a step further. I don't want to just grab that one URL. I want to grab all of my resources inside of my account. So if we head back to the Node SDK and we go to Asset Administration, I can scroll down where particularly what I want to do is I want to list my resources. And we can see that we can easily do that. If I scroll back up to or down to wherever that was, we can see we can use cloudinary.api.resources. Now remember, we're already using v2, so we don't have to specify that again. So all I need to do is use cloudinary.api.resources. So if I head back in, I'm going to say constant resources equal to await, because we're going to be making a request this time, cloudinary.api.resources. Now there's one thing we need to do in addition. When we were just building that URL, we were just doing something that we need the cloud name for. But because we're actually pulling in and using the admin API to request these images, we need to add further configuration for our actual account. And particularly, we need to add our API key and our API secret. Now, even though I'm just doing this for the demo, we want to make sure we're always secure with these values. So I'm going to add these as environment variables. So I'm going to say process.env.cloudinary API key and process.env.cloudinary API secret. But then we're going to define those inside of our environment variable file. And to do that, we need to create that file in the root of our project .env.local, where I'm going to say my API key and my API secret. And we actually need to grab these values now from Cloudinary. So if I head back to my dashboard, if I get out of this, back to my dashboard, just where I was with my cloud name, we can see we also have the API key and the API secret. I'm going to first copy that key, paste it in as the value, and then the API secret, and pass that in as the value. Make sure I save my files. And now if I restart my server, because I added those new environment variables, I have to restart my server. We're going to be able to now take these resources and pass them back in that JSON response. So now if I refresh that resource, we can see that not only do I have that URL, I have all those resources, including all of the pictures like the waterfall or the mountain or the city. Exactly all those resources that I had inside of my media library are now being returned in that response. And this works for everything, whether you want to return all resources like I'm doing here, or if you want to search for resources, really you can pick how you want to get those resources and return them and do whatever you want to manage your media. Cool. So we saw how easy that was, right? Actually, that makes spinning up a new API super simple. We even saw how quick we were able to get up and running with the Cloudinary Node SDK and effectively manage our media. If you want to learn more about how to work with the Cloudinary Node SDK, the docs have a bunch of examples and everything you need to get started. If you head over to spacejelly.dev or youtube.com/ColbyFayock and search Cloudinary, I also have a bunch of use case driven examples, as well as a new repository with a bunch of straight code examples using Cloudinary in projects. More to come, and I'm also taking requests. And that's it. If you want to learn more or chat about the talk, you can find me everywhere at Colby Fayock. Also tweet out some of the links you've seen here today. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, well, we're here live with Colby. We're going to get to Q&A. So if you have any questions for Colby, please throw them in the Ask a Question module, and we will get to them. Until then, I have a few questions of my own, Colby. First of all, I'm curious about, so I had this idea watching, because I'm looking at all this cool stuff that you can do with removing background, adding filters, blah, blah, blah. I have this idea. Tell me if I'm crazy. The idea is I want to do some of that, but using some of the AI to generate artwork and then maybe integrate that with Cloudinary somehow, like to do, so you could basically like use that, then overlay some like header image, like for blog images that are generated by like, what's the AI that generates all this artwork and stuff like that?
So there's DALL-E and there's Midjourney. At least those are two of the ones that I'm aware of that are always on Twitter. But I love where your mind's at, because my mind's totally there as well. I created this proof of concept where I generate blur hash using a custom function, and insert that into the Cloudinary pipeline. And I'm thinking I can do the exact same thing because ultimately we can run a custom function, a custom serverless function, and say, take this input, which is the image or media data, and then you can do whatever
Right.
you want with it and return it. So why couldn't you use something
Right.
like DALL-E or Midjourney? Now, the only thing that has stopped me from creating a proof of concept like that is just I haven't found an API to use. I think Midjourney is limited to Discord, and I think DALL-E just doesn't have the API yet. I might be wrong, but I was only able to poke with it
Yeah.
in the UI.
Yeah, I think DALL-E, you have to like sign up to be on their waiting list to get access to the API,
Gotcha.
which I think I did, and I have not. But if I did, I haven't heard. I'm pretty sure I did because I'm like, there's definitely, I think serverless even is the way you could, obviously, as you mentioned, you can integrate a serverless function to do that. So like, that's the way you could kind of mix these two technologies together. I was like, oh, well, what if, I mean, obviously the dumb example would be like blog headers or whatever, but like on
Yeah.
CFE, we have all this artwork, and not to put any artists out of business because I have that all custom made. But like, but I'm like, oh, I could save myself a
Yeah.
little money and have Dolly generate art and put this stuff based on the titles, and
And it's funny because I don't know if you've heard of Axios, the news thing. Like I'm on one
yeah,
of their
yeah,
newsletters, and they literally had a section about that yesterday or day before, where they're talking about how their journalist, visual artists, were talking about the AI generation, and comparing what they would do in the newsroom compared to what these generation tools would do. So it's really interesting to see those worlds kind of melding together.
absolutely. And personally, like even if it's just blog or article headers, I would be glad to, I think there's one header of like this guy with he's working on the computer and he's put his hand on his forehead and looks frustrated sitting, and I'm like, that has been used in probably 2,000 blog posts.
Stock
So
photos, stock.
I see it all the time. It's free. It's a free one. I think that's why
Yeah.
everybody uses it.
As long as the AI
So
isn't trained on just a stock photo site, I think we're good to go.
exactly, you end up with the same. Everybody ends up with the same photos generated by Dolly once we're all using it. So another thing I want to talk to you about a little bit, because I mean, I noticed you use Next.js, so I want to kind of dig into a little bit about your use of Next.js, particularly like some of its serverless stuff, because we haven't really talked about that much in this session yet. It's been brought up here and there, but like, can you tell people a little bit more of like how Next.js kind of integrates automatically with serverless, and I think, and also it does some edge stuff as well, right?
Sure. So in terms of like integration, it kind of I'm thinking about how I want to word this so it's not confusing. But so like it's as part of the Next.js tool set, whenever the platform deploys a Next.js project, it's deploying these functions as API endpoints. So I like to reference like actual like AWS or whatever your cloud provider of choice is to kind of connect the dots. But so you have a serverless function and you have the services that allow you to invoke that function. Now, Netlify and Vercel and those kind of tools, they automate all that so you don't have to think about it. So all you're doing is taking your serverless function, putting it in a file, and you're able to deploy that on their services. And you now have an API endpoint that invokes that function. Now, part of Next.js's toolset is that it gives you that ability to kind of create it in that developer experience, which then you can just easily integrate into your front end application, which for all intents and purposes is a React app at that point, right? But ultimately, you're building an API that may or may not have anything to do with the Next.js app itself.
Right. Yeah. It is. It is. I think Next.js kind of simplified things in a way that a lot of other tools hadn't yet, and it's now kind of become a standard. Just even in the way, before you could throw, like on Netlify, for instance, you could throw stuff in a folder and it would work, but it was all kind of, had to have mappings and so on and so forth. But Next.js was just like, hey, just write the code, put it in a function. It's like it knows what to do with it at that point, right?
Yeah, it's just that more, keeping on incrementing on building like a more fluid developer experience, right? Like it's these little things that help us just make it easier to build applications.
Yeah, definitely. And we've also talked a lot about like edge stuff. And I know, you and I were chatting a little bit a moment ago that there's not necessarily like a Cloudinary edge, although I'm assuming the images are served from some kind of CDN of some sort, like media
Totally,
server sitting at the
totally.
edge. But like there's not like a serverless edge per se, right? But we were talking like you could still like maybe do some custom imagery that's running like at the edge, do some customization that actually involves images, not just swapping out text at the edge with the SDKs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to whether it's Netlify, Vercel, whatever your favorite serverless platform is, like the cool thing because they support that edge, like you can really do anything you want. So, for instance, I can serve whatever image I want based off of the input and output of that serverless function. So, while I know a lot of people like to think of the flag based off of where the person is located, what if you take that and apply it to something like e-commerce or maybe Netflix that everybody probably knows of, where maybe you want to show a different image or a banner based off of where that person's located. So we can see where that person is and we can return a Cloudinary URL that will ultimately serve that Cloudinary image and they'll be able to customize it towards that. You can extend that to things like maybe A/B testing where you're controlling those experiments so that people can do that, or even a higher level of personalization to make sure that visitors are getting something that is relevant to them. But because we have that processing on the edge, you can really do whatever you want. You can shoot whatever Cloudinary URL, and you can even customize those parameters on the fly with Cloudinary. You're just having the orchestration of that image come from that serverless function.
That's a good point. In A/B testing is one of those things that I think like edge stuff is kind of, it's like it's made for that because currently in a lot of cases with A/B tests, you'll find like there's client side libraries, or you either have to do server side, or or it comes with a client side library that then has like a flash of content. And if you're dealing with images, this is 100% going to mess up the experience because this is not like some little text that's there like "Hello Brian" at the top of the screen that I'm swapping out at client side. This is like a key element of the page, any of that media being images or video or whatever. And it seems like that would be critical to like be able to do that at the edge as opposed to have to choose either server side rendering or client side swapping it out.
Totally. And like one simple example, a company that I used to work for, we had to legally and logistically have different sales depending on the country, right? The United States had different shipping and things like that. So we served different images. Now we didn't use Cloudinary there, but imagine being able to detect on the edge which country they are and deliver that promotion based off of where they're located, right? It's just going to make it easier rather than having to use some client side service, which we used, that added more load to the page and just made things more complicated.
Yeah, I think this kind of move towards removing some of that client side code and pushing that onto like either a serverless function or even an edge function is really a good shift that we're seeing in the community now, because it hasn't always made for a great experience for the users. And when that stuff happens client side, it's slow.
For sure.
They have to download that. Yeah.
And not to mention, it's not only just a shift. Usually you can have like a simpler code flow, right? Like inside that function, as opposed to having to load all the JavaScript needed to make those transformations in the actual DOM.
Yeah. So you showed some of these filters and stuff. So tell me can you tell me some of your favorites? Because I want to do some like experimenting with. What are some of your obviously you like the sunglasses. I get it, but there's got to be more than just swapping in sunglasses. What are some other cool, like, clearly you have a lot of creative ideas. What are some other cool creative ideas we can do?
Well, I think I like
the
Dali mask, particularly the Money Heist. If you've ever seen that movie, Casa de Papel, if in Spanish. But anyways, the nice thing is like a lot of these are just kind of custom creations. So particularly overlays where like you can provide whatever mask you want. We just use face detection to plop it on the location so that it can be dynamically added to the image, which in my opinion is super cool and one of the compelling reasons for it. But there are a lot of baked in filters and color changes and things like that, but it's really the creativity of the developer that I think makes it such a cool thing to be able to build into your application, like the photo filters.
Yeah. Well, now you're relying on my creativity, and that's a problem. So, okay. Getting back to a little bit about, I want to ask you again about Next.js specifically, returning to that topic. So have you tried, I mean, is Next.js really like the one because I've seen a lot of your talks and you talk a lot about Next.js. What do you think about some of these other, have you tried like Astro or any of these other tools that kind of um, taking on the model of Next.js and taking some different angles to it? Or are you really like your Next.js all the way?
It's been a while since I've used some of the others. Like for a while, I was a big Gatsby person, and Gatsby's still perfectly fine. I just once I kind of got on board the Next.js train, like I haven't found a compelling reason to switch to some of the other frameworks. Not that they don't exist. To be clear, I know I still need to try Svelte because everybody tells me that it's just so amazing. But I don't know, Next.js, I really enjoy the developer experience and how they build their APIs, close to the components and just the way that they're moving forward with the project. So I've really enjoyed developing in it. So it's just something that I kind of keep sticking in. That said, like Astro, like I tried that out when it first came out, and it was really cool and promising. I haven't really given it too much of a shot since then, but I'm excited for the future of it. So it's it's a developing world, and I hope there is more healthy competition between all these frameworks as things grow.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have toyed a little bit. I've done a lot of Next.js too. I've toyed a little bit with Svelte Kit. I really did like Svelte. You know, and as well as Astro. I've done a bit with Astro, and I guess like one of the things is, at least in my experience, you can pretty much do a lot of the similar things like deploying serverless functions as kind of critical to this what we're discussing here in each of those. I think it's not all of them have necessarily like edge stuff built in, but some of them do. I know Netlify was here talking about the adapters for like Astro and other ones that actually will deploy like SSR to the edge, which is a really cool thing. I don't know if you've tried. Have you done much edge stuff at all, or since you're all about images, it's not so much right now?
No, it's funny, like the edge, like I'm fully aware of, the direction it's going and everything, but I just haven't spent too much time building out content around it just because I don't want to create another, here's a different flag depending on it. Like I want to come up with a compelling use case for it before I build content around it. So and that's usually when I start to tinker with things more, finding good, compelling examples to show people why it's so cool in the context of the things I work on.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And it's not, I mean, it may not be that like for particularly when you're trying to like serve up like large media files, maybe I don't know if the edge like plays as much of a role. I think it can, but I'll be honest, I haven't tried it for that either. And right now it's mostly like simple content replaces or like, redirects or other kinds of personalization. So yeah. Well, very cool. Cody, Cody's my boss. Cody and Colby. Yeah, anyway. Colby, it is so good to have you here again. I always love your talks. They're really, really great. Very entertaining, and I love the demos. I was joking that I need to have the "this is fine" superimposed over my image right here, especially with me calling people the wrong name or having my mic on mute. They're not going to invite me back to my own event pretty soon. So anyway, it was great having you here, Colby. Thanks so much
Thanks for having me.
For being here.